Hey friends, welcome. Glad to have you. Thanks for tuning in. Question for you. What did you want to be when you grew up? What did you want to be when you grow up? Some of you are like, I'm still trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. But what did you want to be? I know for me, honestly, ever since a little kid, I really wanted to make video games. That was a big part of mine. Not to date myself, but video games were just taking off big time with first Nintendo and Sega and all that coming out. And I was like, man, I want to go learn how to do that. So I actually started learning how in high school, kind of developing software. We had a couple of cool video games for the Apple II back then. Then went to college for computer science and graduated with my degree in that because I wanted to do that. I did not go on to make video games, but I did go on to develop software and had a lot of fun with some of that. I also would have settled for being an actor. That was the other thing I thought about being when I grew up, or an NFL player. Only a punter though, because I thought that way won't get hurt, and I like to kick. Or NBA player. I want to talk to you today, though, about a guy who got to be what he wanted to be when he grew up, but God came in and kind of changed it in his life. And I've talked to a lot of people recently that have been asking me about just purpose. I mean, that's something we're always wondering. What's my purpose in life? What's my calling? Then you hit a hard time like this, and then even on kind of the smaller scales, what's my sort of purpose in this time, and what am I supposed to do? So I want to show you one of my favorite stories about Jesus. We're talking about this guy all week long since it's Easter week, also called Holy Week. So we thought we'd talk about it this week. Fascinating guy. I think most people in the world, even though people have all different beliefs about faith, people usually don't really have a problem with Jesus. There's a famous quote from Gandhi where he says, I really like your Jesus. I really respect him. It's your Christians that I don't like because they look so different than your Jesus. Ouch. You didn't know Gandhi was such a trash talker, huh? But he had a point. But anyway, so I want to talk about Jesus some today. Great story. It's a guy named Simon, but then later his name gets changed to Peter. So Jesus changes his name from Simon to Peter. So, long before Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, or Prince changed his name to a symbol, or John Mellencamp became John Cougar, and then John Cougar Mellencamp, and then John Mellencamp again. Sorry, 80s reference. Anyway, it's pretty cool when you get a name change. I've had the same name my whole life, but I guess it's pretty cool when you get to go through that. So Peter, he always wanted to be a fisherman when he grew up. Probably was the family business, we assume. And he's living that out. He's being a fisherman in Luke chapter 5. That's what I'm going to tell you a story from tonight. Great story, so you can read it on your own. Luke chapter 5. So we read a story. He's been fishing. All of a sudden, a huge crowd gathers around. They usually don't gather to watch the fishermen, but they're there because the guy's talking, and it's Jesus. And he's a great speaker, and so people are tuned in, and the crowds keep growing bigger and bigger. And of course, back then, Jesus doesn't have bullhorns or amplification, but I'll tell you this: Jesus is a physics genius. That's right, I said that. Side note, somebody made me a t-shirt once that said Jesus is a physics genius, quote by Carter Moss. But anyway, he was a physics genius because he knows that sound is amplified over water, and so he knows if he pushes out on a boat a little ways, his voice can get amplified out over water. So he asked Peter, hey dude, can I borrow your boat? I don't know if he called him dude, but I like to think of that. Can I borrow your boat? And Peter's like, sure, right? It's kind of like celebrity asking to borrow it. So Jesus goes out and he speaks on his boat for a while, and it's pretty awesome. People love it, and they're tuning in. We don't get to know what he talked about, but it says when he's done speaking, he says, hey Peter, why don't we go out fishing now? Why don't we go out fishing? And Peter's like, I've already done that all night in this spot, and we didn't catch anything. And Jesus says, no, just trust me. Just go out, put out your boat deeper. And I'm sure for Peter, it's like, why is a carpenter telling me, a lifelong fisherman, how to be a better fisherman? Don't you hate it when people tell you, you know what you should do? That's one of my least favorite ways that sentences start, by the way. You know what you should do? That'd be like me showing up at your job and just telling you, you know what you need to start doing at your job? And you'd be like, what are you talking about, Pastor Boy? You don't have any skills. Go back to your Sunday job and play golf all week, or whatever you think pastors do. But anyway, Jesus tells Peter, hey, just let's go out deeper and throw in your nets and we'll catch some fish. And right after that, listen, Peter tells him what a dumb idea that is. He says, I already tried it, Jesus. I've been there, done that. But then Peter says, you ready? The 5 most powerful words he ever said. And if you and I could learn to say these 5 words to God, we just might discover more of our purpose and calling. You ready? He says these 5 words. He said, but because you say so. So Peter's saying, listen, I don't understand it. This doesn't make any sense. I already know what I'm doing. But because you say so, I'll do it anyway. I'll put in the nets in this very spot in the water. I love that. Part of what I love about Peter is he's just such an honest, authentic guy. I can relate to him better than some of the Bible kind of superheroes because Peter is just such a real guy. And you see in the story, he has so little faith. Later, Jesus would go on to teach, you only need about a mustard seed's worth of faith, which is the smallest seed, by the way. Jesus was also a gardener. He was a horticulturist and a physics genius, but a mustard seed of faith. And so Peter only has a little bit of faith, but it's just barely enough to put the nets in the water anyway. Listen, a lot of times God's ways in our life aren't going to make any sense. That's no surprise to us. When you read the prophet Isaiah in the Old Testament, he said, God's ways are not your ways. His thoughts are not your thoughts. And I hear him saying, my brain's too puny to always understand what God is up to. So I don't know if God's ever done stuff where you say, I don't understand why, Carter. I don't get it. Man, I've had that experience so many times that I don't know what he's doing. But listen, if we can learn even when I don't know the why, and even when I don't feel like doing something, and even when it doesn't make sense to me, if I sense God's calling me to do it, will I say, but because you say so? Because you say so, I will. So Peter did, right? Just barely enough faith. So if you're like, man, I don't have any faith, Carter. I only got a tiny bit. It only takes just enough to put the net in. He does. Next scene is actually funny. So picture this. Instead of pulling up the net and going, look, there's fish. They get so many fish. Peter calls his buddy over in his other boat. And now both boats are so full of fish, they're almost sinking. So they're both, and just picture fish flopping around everywhere. One day my wife and I were walking on the OB Pier, and it was crazy. It's always lined with a ton of fishermen, but it was a weird night. In this 1 minute that we're walking down the pier, all of a sudden, all these guys caught fish at the same time. One dude pulled up like a lobster. We literally saw a stingray. Fish are flopping on the pier, and my wife's freaking out. She's like, we're in a horror movie. So I think that's a little bit of what it was like. There's fish everywhere. Peter can't believe it. He's totally humbled, and Jesus says these great words to him. He says, hey, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And maybe some of you just needed to hear that today. That's the first word a lot of the angels say in the stories you read, and then Jesus says, hey, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And then he says this, whether you, if you read the story in Luke 5, it's don't be afraid. If you read the story in Matthew 4, it says this other phrase. I think Jesus said both things. Each guy just recorded one of the phrases, but he says, hey, come follow me. Come follow me. And I just want you to know that Jesus says both of those things to you today. He says, hey, don't be afraid, even if what you see isn't making sense. Don't be afraid. Just come follow me. Come walk with me. And then Jesus says this great line. You ready? He says, from now on, Peter, you're going to fish for people. And I love that Jesus said, you, a fisherman, are going to fish for people, because I believe Jesus speaks our unique language. He speaks in a way that's relevant to who you are and how you're wired up. He's not just one size fits all. He's a personal God. I want you to hear that in the story. He's a personal God. He says, let's go fish for people. I like to think if Jesus was talking to a construction worker, he'd say, come follow me. Let's go build the kingdom. If he was speaking to a mechanic, he'd say, come follow me, let's go fix the world. If he was speaking to someone military, he'd say, come follow me, let's go fight for souls. If he's speaking to a banker, he'd say, let's go invest in people. If he's speaking to an artist, he'd say, let's go paint and create new possibilities. Let's bring beauty into the world. He speaks to you where you're at and how you're wired up. So I hope you hear that in there. He was just speaking that. And then notice his promise to him wasn't just, come follow me. I'm going to make sure you have plenty of fish in your life. It's like that old saying, right? Give someone a fish and you feed them for a day. Teach someone to fish and they'll spend the rest of their life in a boat drinking beer, fishing. Just kidding. That's my joke version of that one. No, but right. So instead of just saying, come follow me, Peter, and you always have plenty of fish in your life. You know what? He's beyond just meeting his immediate need. He says, I'm calling you to something deeper. I'm going to give you a new purpose and a new calling. I'm going to teach you how to fish for people. And Jesus wants to breathe actually new purpose and new calling into you. And sometimes for us, that means that we make a major change, a career change even. For Peter, by the way, he left being a fisherman for a while and went and walked around with Jesus. I started as a software developer, computer programmer, as I mentioned at the beginning. And part of me following God meant a huge career change. And the pay cut that went with it. Boom. Just kidding. And so I went from programmer to pastor. He said, come follow me. Let's go program people. And so I made that career change. I got another friend at our campus. She used to be a model and do some other things. And she ended up following God's call into starting a nonprofit to help girls rescued from human trafficking. I have another buddy. He actually was in the business world. Then he was pastor for a while. And then he realized God actually wants to use me back as a businessman. So he went back into that. So sometimes it's for you, it's going to be kind of these radical changes if you'll have enough faith to say, but because you said so, I'll do that. Other times it's using us right where we're at. There's many other stories of Jesus. He talks to soldiers, government workers, blue collar, white collar people right where they're at and says, I want to help you live out my mission where you're at. So I'm huge on purpose and calling. I've studied it a lot because that's a huge thing that my faith has brought me. One of the biggest things I found in Jesus was new purpose for everything I do, not just in my career, but even as a software developer for 10 years, living out my faith in that way. So I want to help you because I know a lot of people struggle with purpose and calling. A few books to read, check it out. Hey, you got time to read? What better you got to do? All right, look these up. Maybe you've heard of the best-selling nonfiction book of all time next to the Bible, written by a guy right here in Southern California, Rick Warren. It's called The Purpose-Driven Life. So go check it out if you never have. Great book I read a couple years ago called Garden City by John Mark Comer, and it's best stuff I've read on how to tie work and faith and see any job we do as helping bring about the mission of God. And then one I just finished called Called to Create, and that ties your job, especially if you're in a creative type career, also into your faith by a guy named Jordan Rayner. So you can check out those. But I just want you to know God has purpose for you, I promise. And your purpose, it fits into your job and your career, but also fits into everything that you do and fits in even when we're in crisis and we're just wondering, what's my purpose anymore? He wants to speak it to you, but it always starts by me being willing to have just enough faith, just barely enough to say, I don't understand it, I don't get it, but because you say so, I will do it. And so I hope you do that, and can't wait to see what God does in you. Let me know if you got more questions. Have a great night.